In the autumn of 1956, a county road crew working a forgotten stretch of the Missouri Ozarks drove a grading blade into what every man on that job swore was solid limestone. It was not limestone. It was a wall. A finished wall, dressed and squared and set in mortar, sitting more than 11 feet beneath a hillside that no survey map had ever marked as anything but wilderness. When they cleared the dirt away by hand, they found a door. And behind that door, sealed in the dark for 90 years, was the last of the Yarnwick Clan. What those men pulled out of the hillside did not match anything in the history books. The bones were wrong. The tools were wrong. The house itself, buried whole and standing beneath the mud, was wrong. Within a single week, the site was fenced, the road was rerouted around the ridge, and the story was quietly buried a second time. For most of a century, the name Yarnwick meant nothing to anyone outside 3 families in one narrow holler. Today, that changes. Because what actually happened on that ridge in 1866 is not really a story about a savage family gone feral in the hills. It is a story about what this entire country was quietly built on top of. And once you see it laid out, plainly, in order, you are not going to be able to unsee it. Before we go one step further, I need you to do one small thing for me. Drop a single word in the comments right now. Just type the word buried. That is how I know who actually stayed with this instead of scrolling past, and it tells the algorithm to carry this story to the people who are ready to hear it. One word. Buried. Then stay close, because everything after this point only gets stranger, and I do not want you to miss the moment it all connects. To understand the Yarnwicks, you first have to understand the ground they stood on. And the ground they stood on is older and far stranger than almost anyone in a schoolroom will ever admit. The Ozark Plateau covers a vast stretch of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, and it is one of the oldest exposed landscapes on the continent. Geologists will tell you the rock here has been sitting undisturbed for hundreds of millions of years. But the people who actually lived in these hollers in the 1800s told a very different story about the land under their feet. They talked about hills that were too regular, ridges that ran in straight lines for miles, as if something had been graded flat and then swallowed by the earth, caves with squared corners, springs that ran up out of the ground through what looked, when the water was low, like the mouth of a buried pipe. The official story of the Ozarks in the years right after the Civil War is a story of emptiness. We are told this was raw frontier, thinly settled, a place where a handful of hardscrabble families scraped a living out of thin soil and rock. But that emptiness is exactly the part that never made sense to anyone who read the older records closely. Because the land was not empty. It had been emptied. Travellers who came through in the 1840s and 50s wrote about entire abandoned settlements with no clear history, foundations of cut stone with no record of who laid them, roads that led to nothing, orchards gone wild that no living person remembered planting. And running underneath all of it, in the county ledgers and the church rolls and the letters people mailed back east, was the same quiet confusion, over and over again. Where did everybody go? Who was here before us? And why does none of it line up with what we were told? The Yarnwicks came into this land in the year 1849, according to the one land entry that still carries their name, and from the very beginning the neighbours knew there was something different about them. They did not arrive the way other families arrived. Most settlers came up the rivers or overland through the established trails, in wagons loaded with everything they owned. The Yarnwicks appeared to already be there. The first mention of them in the county comes not from an arrival but from a complaint, a note about a family living on a ridge that no one had seen them travel to, in a house that no one remembered being built. When a neighbour named Coyle first laid eyes on the Yarnwick homestead, he described it in a letter to his brother as a place that felt, and these are his words as they survive, older than the trees around it. There were, at that first counting, 11 of them. An old man the others called the grandfather, though no one could ever pin down his age, a woman who ran the household, several grown sons and daughters, and a scatter of children who were rarely seen and never sent to any school. They spoke English, but with an accent no one in the county could place, an accent that some described as clipped and formal, almost like reading, and others described as something they had simply never heard before and never heard again. They kept to themselves. That, on its own, would not have been strange. Plenty of hill families kept to themselves. But the Yarnwicks kept to themselves in a way that made people uneasy. They traded, but only for very specific things, and never for the things you would expect a farm family to need. They did not buy seed. They did not buy tools. They did not buy cloth or nails or salt in any quantity that would feed and clothe 11 people through an Ozark winter. What they bought, according to the 2-store ledgers that survived from that decade, was lamp oil. Enormous quantities of lamp oil, far more than any household above ground could ever burn. And that detail, the lamp oil, is the first thread. Because if you are burning that much oil, you are lighting something very large, and you are lighting it underground. Now, the homestead itself is where this story stops being a strange local tale and becomes something else entirely. From the outside, in those early years, the Yarnwick place looked almost ordinary. A long, low house of dark timber, a few outbuildings, a stone well. It sat near the crown of a ridge, tucked into a fold of the hill where the land dropped away sharply on one side. But the people who got close to it, and there were not many, all came away describing the same handful of details that did not belong. The stonework was the first thing. The foundation of the house, and the walls of the well, and the base of what the family called the cellar, were not built from the rough field stone that every other settler in the region used. They were cut, precisely cut, in large regular blocks, fitted so tightly together that a man named Ephraim Doss, a stonemason by trade who visited the ridge once in 1858, said you could not slide the blade of a knife between them. Doss had built chimneys and foundations across 3 counties. He knew what local hands could do, and he said, flatly, that no one in the Ozarks had the tools or the skill to cut and set stone like that. He also said something stranger. He said the blocks did not look built. He said they looked uncovered, as if the house had been raised on top of a foundation that was already there, already ancient, already waiting in the ground. The second thing was the cellar. Every account of the Yarnwick homestead mentions the cellar, and every account describes it with the same lowered voice. It was not a root cellar, it was a stair, a wide stone stair, descending from a doorway in the back of the house, going down into the hill farther than anyone was ever allowed to follow. The children who were seen above ground were pale in a way that people remarked on, pale like something that lived out of the sun. And the lamp oil, that river of lamp oil the family carried up the ridge year after year, was going down those stairs and never coming back. A travelling preacher named Josiah Vane spent a single night near the homestead in the summer of 1861, having lost his way in a storm. He wrote about it later, and his account is one of the few first-hand descriptions we have of what the place felt like after dark. He said the hill hummed, not the wind, not insects, not water, a low, steady hum that seemed to come up through the soles of his feet, from somewhere far below the house. He said he saw light leaking from the seams around the cellar door, a light he described as too white and too even to be a flame. And he said that when he asked the old grandfather what was down there, the man looked at him for a long moment and answered with a single sentence that Vane never forgot. "The old world," the grandfather said, "does not stay buried just because they covered it." Vane left before dawn. He never went back. And for the rest of his life, whenever anyone asked about the Yarnwick Ridge, he would only say that some doors are shut for a reason. Before we move on to what the crew found beneath the floor, stop for a second. What you just heard about what the Yarnwicks kept beneath that house is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county survey report. The buried foundation, the 90-year silence. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. So what was down there? What was under the Yarnwick house, at the bottom of that stone stair, drinking all that light? We now have a fairly detailed answer, and it comes from the most reliable source imaginable, the men who finally went down those stairs in 1956 with electric torches and a state surveyor taking notes. But to understand what they found, you have to hold 2 facts in your head at the same time. The first fact is that the Yarnwick house was buried, not fallen, not collapsed. Buried, standing upright and nearly whole, under 11 feet of packed earth and a layer of what the surveyor's report calls, in careful official language, fine grey sediment consistent with rapid waterborne deposition. That phrase is doing a tremendous amount of work, and we are going to come back to it, because that grey sediment is one of the most important things in this entire story. The second fact is that below the house, the stair kept going. The surveyors expected a cellar, a hole in the ground, a storage room, maybe a natural cave the family had walled off. What they found instead, once they had cleared the buried doorway and descended, was a chamber that stopped every one of them cold. It was a room of cut stone, far larger than the house above it. The walls were the same precisely fitted blocks that had baffled the stonemason a century before, but here, underground, protected from the weather, they were pristine, and they were not blank. Running around the room, at about the height of a man's chest, was a band of carved figures and symbols that no one on that crew could read. The surveyor, a practical man not given to flights of fancy, wrote in his report that the carvings did not resemble any Native American work he had seen, nor anything European, nor anything he could name at all. He described them as geometric, repetitive, and deliberate, and he noted that similar markings had been reported at 2 other sites in the region, and that in both cases the sites had been, and I am quoting the report directly, closed to further study. In the centre of that room was the source of the hum. It was a structure of stone and dark metal, roughly the size of a wagon, and though it had sat sealed in the earth for 90 years, the surveyor recorded that the air around it was warm, warmer than the surrounding chamber, by a margin he could measure but could not explain. There were no coals, there was no fire, there was nothing burning, and there had been nothing burning for the better part of a century. And yet the stone was warm, and faint threads of that too white light still moved, slow as syrup, through veins in the metal. The lamp oil, it turned out, had never been fuel. It had been something the family poured into channels in the floor around the structure, the way you might oil a machine to keep it from seizing. They were not lighting the dark. They were tending something, maintaining it, keeping alive, by hand, across generations, a device that predated their house, predated the county, and by every honest measure should not have existed at all. Now, if you have spent any time looking into the history that gets left out of the textbooks, you already know the word that hangs over a room like that. And we are going to say it plainly, because dancing around it helps no one. The structure the Yarnwicks tended is exactly the kind of thing described in the older, buried account of this continent, the account that got scrubbed and rewritten in the second half of the 1800s. The account of an advanced civilization that was here before the frontier ever was. A civilization with masonry we cannot reproduce, with a source of heat and light that needed no fuel, and with an infrastructure that ran, quite literally, under our feet. A civilization that did not slowly fade away. A civilization that was ended, all at once, and then covered over. Covered by mud. Let us talk about the mud, because the mud is the whole case. Go back to that phrase from the surveyor's report. Fine grey sediment consistent with rapid waterborne deposition. In plain speech, that means the Yarnwick house was not slowly buried by the ordinary drift of leaves and soil over centuries. It was buried fast, in a single event, by a wall of water heavy with silt that rolled over the ridge, filled the valley, and set like concrete when it dried. 11 feet of it, packed hard, sealing a standing house whole. The mainstream explanation for that kind of deposit is a flood. A big one, a local catastrophe, a freak event. And on its own, one buried house could be explained that way. But the Yarnwick house is not on its own. Across the country and across the world, there are buildings sunk to their first floor windows in exactly this kind of grey silt. There are cities where the ground floor of every old structure is below street level, doors and windows swallowed, and the only explanation offered is that people, for some reason, kept building higher and higher on top of their own foundations. There are courthouses and mansions and cathedrals photographed in the 1800s already half buried, with no record of the flood that did it. And every time, the same fine grey sediment. Every time, the same shrug. Every time, the same refusal to connect one buried building to the next. The Yarnwicks did not have to guess about any of this, because the Yarnwicks lived it, or rather, their forebears did. The old grandfather's answer to the preacher was not the ranting of a madman. The old world does not stay buried just because they covered it. He was stating a fact about his own family's past. They were survivors. Not survivors of the Civil War, not survivors of some Indian raid, but survivors of the covering itself. A remnant, a single thread of people who had come through the mud when nearly everyone else had not, and who had done the one thing survivors of a lost world always try to do. They kept a piece of it alive. They found one of the old machines still standing, and they built a house over it, and they spent 100 years tending its light so that it would not go out. And that, more than the strange stone or the warm dark metal, is what began to change them. Because here is the part of the story the locals actually remembered. Not the machine, not the mud, the change. Over the years, the Yarnwicks lived on that ridge. The family that had arrived, strange and quiet, became something the whole county was afraid of. It happened slowly, the way these things do, so that no single moment could be pointed to. In the early years, the Yarnwicks were merely odd. They traded at the store. They nodded to neighbours on the road. The pale children were occasionally glimpsed at the edge of the woods. But as the 1850s wore into the 1860s, the sightings changed in character. The nods stopped. The trading grew rarer and then stopped altogether, which raised the question of how 11 people were feeding themselves at all, and the glimpses of the children, when they came, began to frighten grown men. A farmer named Wallace Troupe, whose land bordered the Yarnwick Ridge on its northern edge, kept a rough journal, and several pages of it survive in a county historical collection. Troupe was not a superstitious man. His journal is mostly weather and livestock, and the price of hogs. But beginning in the winter of 1863, a new subject creeps into his entries, and it never leaves. He writes about tracks in his fields, bare human tracks, in the snow, circling his house in the dead of night, coming down from the direction of the ridge. He writes about his dogs, 3 of them, that would not go near the tree line after dark and that one by one simply vanished. He writes about a sound in the woods that he first took for a bobcat and then, one clear, cold night, recognized with horror as a human voice trying to imitate one. The Yarnwicks, Troupe wrote, do not come down to trade any more. They come down to watch, and they are not eating what a Christian family eats. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a simple horror story about cannibals in the hills, and there were plenty of those told about the Ozarks in the years to come, most of them invented for entertainment. But the Troupe Journal is not entertainment. It is the private record of a frightened man writing only for himself, and what it describes is a family that was, over the course of a single decade, losing something. Losing its humanity, if you want to put it that way, but losing it in a very particular direction. They were becoming nocturnal. They were becoming silent. They were becoming, in Troupe's repeated and chilling phrase, more like the ridge, as if the thing they tended in the dark was tending them back, as if a century of living beside that warm humming stone, breathing that air, drinking water that ran up through the buried pipes of the old world, had begun to remake them into something that belonged down there rather than up here. By 1865, the county had stopped pretending the Yarnwicks were just another hill family. Children were forbidden from the Ridge Road. A travelling peddler went up that road in the spring of that year to try his luck selling to the strange family everyone talked about, and he was never seen again. His cart was found 3 weeks later at the bottom of a ravine, picked clean, with no sign of the man and no sign of his horse. No one investigated too hard. In the aftermath of the war, in a county with barely any law to speak of, a missing peddler was simply a missing peddler. But everyone knew which road he had taken, and everyone stopped taking it. The neighbours began to talk, quietly, in the way frightened rural people talk, about doing something. And the story of what they finally did, in the terrible winter of 1866, is the story of how the Yarnwicks were sealed into the earth and how the ridge went silent for 90 years. The winter of 1866 came down hard and early on the Ozarks. By late November the hollows were choked with snow, the creeks had frozen to their beds, and the small scattered community that lived within a few miles of the Yarnwick Ridge had drawn in on itself the way rural people do when the cold and the fear arrive together. We know what happened next from 3 separate sources, and the remarkable thing is how closely they agree. There is the tail end of the Troupe Journal. There is a letter written many years later by a woman named Alma Coyle, granddaughter of the same Coyle who had first laid eyes on the homestead in 1849, and there is the oral account, written down in the 1930s by a folklorist collecting hill stories, given by an old man who claimed his father had been there. 3 voices, decades apart, telling the same story, and the story is this. The men of the community, some dozen of them, went up the ridge road together on a night in December, armed, carrying not just guns but shovels, timber, and mortar. They had not gone to fight. You do not bring mortar to a fight. They had gone to close something. What they met on the ridge, in the accounts, is described only in fragments, as if none of the 3 sources could bear to say too much. Troupé's final legible entry, written in a shaking hand, mentions the door standing open at the back of the house and a smell coming up out of it that he could not describe and did not try to. The Coyle letter speaks of the family scattering, not running away down the hill toward the men, but downward, back into the earth, into the stone stair, choosing the dark over the confrontation. The old man's account is the most direct. The Yarnwicks, he said, went back down to the thing they kept, and the men from the valley did not follow them. Instead, the men did the only thing they could think to do. They sealed the door. They walled up the entrance to the stair. They filled the back of the house with timber and stone and mortar, working through the freezing night, closing the passage between the world above and the world below. And then, according to all 3 sources, they did something that has never been fully explained. They did not burn the house. They did not tear it down. They buried it. Now, a dozen men with shovels cannot bury a standing house under 11 feet of packed earth in a single night. That is a physical impossibility, and it is the detail that makes people dismiss the whole account. But read the sources carefully, and you will see that not one of them actually claims the men did the burying. Troupé's hand gives out mid-sentence. The Coyle letter says only that by spring the ridge was changed and the house was gone from sight. The old man's account says, and this is the line that should stop you cold, that after the men sealed the door, the hill took the house down itself. The hill took the house down itself, as if the same force that had buried the old world in grey mud a century or a millennium before was still there, still active, still capable of pulling a structure down into the earth when the door to the buried world was opened and then shut. The men went up to seal a family into a cellar, and something far larger answered. By the spring of 1867, the Yarnwick homestead was gone, not ruined, gone. Where the long dark house had stood on the crown of the ridge, there was now a smooth swell of hillside, grassed over within a few seasons, indistinguishable from the wilderness around it. The road that had led there was allowed to grow shut. Within a generation, the few people who had known the truth were dead, and the Yarnwicks passed into the vague half-life of a story parents told to keep children off a certain ridge. A savage family, folks said. Cannibals, some said. Gone now, all agreed. Best not to go up there, best not to dig. And for 90 years, no one did. 90 years is a long time. Long enough for the Civil War to become history, for the frontier to close, for automobiles and telephones and electric light to reach even the deepest hollows. Long enough for the people who had sealed the ridge to become names on weathered gravestones, and then to become nothing at all. The story of the Yarnwicks thinned with each retelling until it was just a shape, a warning without a reason, the kind of thing an old-timer might mention and a young person might laugh at. But the ridge remembered, and the ground kept its secret exactly the way it had been made to. Then came 1956, and the road crew, and the grading blade that struck a wall where there should have been only stone. The men who made the discovery were not archaeologists or historians. They were labourers on a state road project, cutting a new route through country that the maps still showed as empty. When the blade caught and rang against dressed stone 11 feet down, the foreman assumed they had hit bedrock and ordered it dug around. It was only when a young worker climbed down into the cut and put his hand on the exposed surface that anyone understood what they were looking at. Squared blocks, mortar joints, a corner. And then, as they cleared, the unmistakable frame of a doorway, sealed with a wall of rougher stone that did not match the fine work around it. The sealed door of 1866, waiting. The foreman did the responsible thing. He stopped work and reported the find, and because the site was on a state project, the report went up the chain to people whose job it was to evaluate such things. Within days, a small team arrived, including the state surveyor whose report we have already leaned on so heavily. And over the course of about a week, that team did what the men of 1866 had gone to such lengths to prevent. They opened the door. I have described some of what they found below, the great carved chamber, the warm humming structure, the two white lights still moving through the dark metal after 90 years. But I have saved the worst of it, and the most human of it, for now, because the Yarnwicks were still there. Behind the sealed door, on the stone stair, and in the buried house, the team found remains. Human remains, or nearly human, of at least 7 individuals. And the condition and arrangement of those remains is the single most disturbing element in the entire record, so much so that the surveyor's report handles it in the coldest, briefest language of any section, as if the writer wanted to get through it and out the other side as fast as possible. They had not died in the ceiling. That was the first shock. The men of 1866 had walled the family in, yes, but the family had not simply starved in the dark over a few weeks and become skeletons. The remains showed signs of having lived, down there, in the sealed chamber, for a long time after the door was closed. There were the ashes of fires. There were the gnawed bones of animals that must have come up through the buried passages of the old world from somewhere the men above never knew existed. There were markings on the walls, made from the inside, that matched the geometric carvings of the ancient builders, as if the last Yarnwicks in their final years had stopped writing in any human script and begun writing in the language of the thing they served. And the bodies themselves were wrong. Let us talk about the bones, carefully, because this is where the story stops being folklore and starts being physical evidence, the kind of evidence that either gets studied openly or gets made to disappear. In the case of the Yarnwicks, it was made to disappear, but not before it was measured. The remains recovered from the buried chamber shared a set of features that do not fit a normal Ozark farm family of the 1800s or a normal human population of any era. The first was size. Several of the individuals were tall. Not unusually tall by the standards of a basketball court, but tall enough that the surveyor recorded specific long bone measurements and then noted, in a line that was later underlined by someone else in a different ink, that the femur lengths implied statures well above the average for the period, in a couple of cases approaching 7 feet. Now, tall people exist, but a whole family clustered at that height, in isolation, in a region where the average man of the 1860s stood a good deal shorter, is the kind of statistical oddity that makes a careful observer sit up. The second feature was the skull. The reports describe a pronounced elongation and thickness to the cranial bone, and a heaviness to the brow, that the surveyor, again choosing his words like a man walking on ice, called not consistent with the local population. He did not say more than that. He did not have to. Anyone who has looked into the buried history of this continent knows that elongated skulls turn up again and again at exactly these kinds of anomalous sites, and that they are, again and again, quietly removed from public view, catalogued and then lost, sent away to institutions and never seen again. The Yarnwick skulls followed that exact path, as we will see. The third feature is the one that the surveyor could not fit into any careful language at all, and so he simply recorded it and moved on. The bone itself was wrong, denser than it should have been, heavier in the hand, and in 2 of the individuals there were signs of what the report calls anomalous mineralization, veins of a dark material running through the bone, following the shape of blood vessels, as if the very thing the family had been tending in the dark had gotten inside them and begun, slowly, over generations, to replace what they were made of with something else. That warm, dark metal, threaded through their bones. The old grandfather had told the preacher the truth. The old world does not stay buried, and it does not stay outside of you either, once you spend 100 years breathing its air and drinking its water and tending its light. I know how that sounds. I want you to sit with how it sounds, because your discomfort is the whole point. Everything we are taught about the past is designed to make a family like the Yarnwicks impossible. There is no room in the official story for a machine that runs without fuel, or a mud flood that swallowed a civilization, or a bloodline that was slowly turned into something inhuman by proximity to the ruins of the old world. And because there is no room for it, when the physical proof of it comes up out of the ground, the proof is what has to go, not the story. The story survives, because a story can be laughed at. The proof gets removed. Which brings us to the artifacts, because the Yarnwicks did not only leave bones, they left things, and the things are, in some ways, even harder to explain away than the bodies. The chamber and the buried house together yielded a collection of objects that the recovery team crated up and hauled out over the course of that single week. The surveyor's report includes a partial inventory, and reading it is like reading a list of items that should not be able to sit next to each other in time. There were ordinary things, of course. Iron cooking pots, the remains of clothing, tools that any farm of the 1860s might have owned. But mixed in with those ordinary things were objects the report can only describe, not identify. There was a disc of the same dark metal as the central structure, perfectly round, perfectly smooth, cool to the touch on one side and faintly warm on the other, with no seam and no mark of manufacture. There were lengths of a material that looked like glass, but did not break, ribbed and jointed like something meant to carry a current or a fluid. There were tablets of fired clay covered edge to edge in the geometric script, the same script from the walls, dozens of them, an entire library in a language no living person could read. And there was one object that the surveyor described in a single sentence and then never mentioned again, a hand-sized shape of the dark metal that, when he first picked it up in the sealed chamber, was cold, and that by the time he carried it up into the daylight, had grown warm enough that he set it down and did not touch it again. Think about what that inventory represents. A family of dirt-poor recluses on an Ozark ridge, who bought nothing but lamp oil, who wove their own cloth and forged their own crude tools, were also sitting on a collection of manufactured objects that our own factories, then and arguably now, could not reproduce. They did not make those things. No one in 1866 made those things. Those objects came from below, from the buried world the Yarnwicks had built their house on top of. The family were not inventors, they were caretakers. Custodians of a hoard they did not fully understand, salvaged from the ruins of something vast, guarding it in the dark until the dark finally took them. And every single one of those objects, along with every bone, every clay tablet, every measurement and photograph and page of notes, was gone within weeks. The disappearance of the Yarnwick evidence is a study in how these things are actually done, and it is worth walking through slowly because it is the same pattern you will find at anomalous site after anomalous site if you know to look for it. It does not happen with black helicopters and men in dark suits, whatever the movies have trained you to expect. It happens with paperwork. It happens with reassignment. It happens with the quiet, boring machinery of institutions doing exactly what institutions are built to do, which is to protect the story they are already committed to. Within days of the surveyor filing his report, the site changed hands. It stopped being a road project curiosity and became, in the language of the records, a matter for review by a higher authority. The road crew was pulled off the ridge and set to work on a different stretch miles away. A fence went up, chain link and quick, ringing the cut where the buried house had been exposed, and a new road route was drawn, one that bent well clear of the ridge, so that the highway which was supposed to run straight through that hillside instead makes, to this day, an unexplained curve around empty ground. You can drive it. The curve is still there. There is nothing on the inside of it but trees and a low grassy swell of hill, and no sign at all telling you why the engineers went to the expense of bending a state highway around a patch of nothing. The crates went to an institution. The report names it, or named it, but that is one of the sections that is hardest to read in the surviving copies, because a later hand went through and struck lines out. What we can piece together is that the remains and the artifacts were shipped east for what was called proper analysis and permanent curation, and that they arrived because there is a receiving record. And then the trail ends. There is no analysis. There is no catalogue. There is no follow-up study, no published paper, no exhibit. 7 sets of anomalous human remains, a library of inscribed tablets, and a collection of objects that defy manufacture entered a major collection in 1956 and were never heard from again. Ask about them today, and you will be told, politely, that no such items can be located in the records, which is not the same as saying they were never there. It is a very specific way of saying that they are gone. The surveyor himself is the last thread, and his fate is the most human part of the cover-up. He was, by every account, a solid, unremarkable state employee who happened to write down exactly what he saw. Within a year of the Yarnwick site, he was reassigned to a distant district, given work far below his qualifications, and effectively shelved. He tried, apparently, to interest people in what he had documented. He wrote letters. He kept a personal copy of his report, which is in fact the copy that most of what you are hearing today ultimately descends from, because the official copy is the one that got so heavily struck through. And he was, for his trouble, gently and thoroughly discredited. A man who imagines things. A man who got carried away. By the time he died, the story of the buried house on the ridge had become, in the mouths of the people who had managed him, an embarrassing episode, a cautionary tale about a surveyor who let a spooky old ruin get the better of his professional judgment. That is how it is done. Not with violence, with patience and paperwork, and the slow suffocation of anyone who insists on remembering. But the surveyor's personal copy survived, and the Troupe journal survived, in a county collection no one thought to purge, and the Coyle letter survived, folded in a family Bible, and the old man's account survived, written down by a folklorist who thought he was collecting a ghost story and did not realize he was recording history. 4 fragile threads, each preserved by accident, each meaningless on its own, together telling a single coherent story that no institution ever intended to let you assemble. That is why you are hearing it now. Not because it was found in an archive, but because it was found in the cracks between the archives, in the places the erasing hand did not think to reach. So step back with me now, all the way back, and look at what this one ridge in the Ozarks is actually telling us, because the Yarnwicks are not the point. The Yarnwicks are a keyhole, and what you can see through that keyhole is the shape of a much larger door. Every element of their story maps onto the buried history that gets systematically kept out of your education, and it maps onto it with unnerving precision. Start with the mud. That fine grey sediment, that flood that came fast and set like stone, is not local to one Ozark hillside. It is everywhere. It is under the ground floors of old cities on every continent. It is halfway up the walls of buildings that stand in photographs from the 1800s already sinking into it, with no recorded flood to blame. The official story asks you to believe that thousands of these buildings, all over the earth, were simply constructed with their first floors underground, on purpose, for reasons no one can quite name. The Yarnwick Ridge asks you to believe the far simpler thing your own eyes keep telling you, that there was a covering, a single great burial of a previous world, in mud and silt, and that we have been living on top of the graveyard ever since, calling the buried buildings, basements, and the buried cities, foundations, and the buried civilization a thing that never was. Then there is the masonry. The stonework that a master mason in 1858 could not explain, cut and fitted with a precision no local hand possessed, that he said looked uncovered rather than built. You will find that same masonry in the star forts scattered across the world, in the impossible walls that turn up on every continent, in the great cut and fitted blocks that the official story credits to men with copper chisels and rope and endless patience. The Yarnwicks did not build their foundation. They found it. And in finding it, they became, without meaning to, witnesses to the fact that someone, long before the frontier, was building on this continent with a skill we have never matched and cannot account for. Then there is the machine, the warm stone, the light that needed no fuel, the current running through veins of dark metal after 90 years in the dark. This is the piece that the modern mind rejects hardest, and it is the piece that recurs most persistently in the buried record. A world lit and warmed and powered by something drawn from the air and the earth itself, freely, without smoke, without fuel, without the endless burning that our world runs on. The old buildings full of ornate ironwork that no one can explain the purpose of. The towers and domes and spires that make no sense as decoration but perfect sense as apparatus. A whole vanished infrastructure of free and ambient power, torn out and forgotten and replaced with something we could be made to pay for by the barrel and the wire. The Yarnwicks kept one node of that old grid alive by hand, with lamp oil, for 100 years. And when they died, it was still warm. And then there are the bones, the height, the heavy brow, the elongated skulls that always seem to surface at these sites and always seem to vanish into the same institutional dark. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself why a simple find, a few tall skeletons in an old cellar, would need to be crated up and shipped away and lost. Bones do not threaten anything unless they threaten the story. And these bones threaten the story completely, because they are physical evidence that the people who lived on this land before the covering were not the people we are told about. They were something older, something larger, a population that the buried record calls by many names, and that the official record calls nothing at all, because the official record has quietly erased them from the ground up. This is the reset, and the Yarnwicks lived on the seam of it. Not a slow decline, not a natural fading of one age into the next, but a covering, a burial, a deliberate resetting of the world that swept away an advanced civilization and left behind an emptied land and a population that could be told a brand new story about who they were and where they came from. Think about how the Ozarks were described in the years the Yarnwicks arrived. Empty, raw, unsettled, but we already saw that it was not empty. It was emptied. Abandoned settlements no one remembered building, orchards no one remembered planting, roads to nowhere, foundations with no history. The land bore every mark of a place that had been full and then, all at once, been swept clean. And into that swept clean land came new people, waves of them, to be settled on top of the old world without ever being told what lay beneath their fields. Consider the great movements of population in exactly this era. The trains full of children, orphans by the tens of thousands, shipped from crowded eastern cities out into a countryside that was supposedly empty, distributed to families and towns across a frontier that we are told had almost no one on it. Where did all those children come from? Where did all those adults come from, the endless waves of them, to fill a continent that a covering had emptied? The buried record suggests something that the official record will never say, that a great many of the people resettled onto this land in the 1800s were, in a real sense, survivors and orphans of the reset itself, given new names and new stories, and set down on top of the graves of the world they had lost, remembering nothing. The Yarnwicks are what it looks like when someone remembers. When a single bloodline does not get swept clean, does not accept the new story, but instead holds on, generation after generation, to the truth of what was here and what was lost. They did not resettle and forget. They found a surviving node of the old world, and they refused to let it die. And the price of that refusal, the price of remembering, was that they were slowly pulled out of the human story altogether. They became the thing everyone else was made to forget. And when they were finally sealed into the earth in 1866, and the hill took the house down over them, it was not just a family being buried. It was the last living memory of the old world being pushed back under the mud so that the new story could go on undisturbed. I want to slow down here, because it would be easy to hear all of this as a tale of victims, a sad account of a family destroyed and a truth suppressed. But the Yarnwicks were not only victims, and that is the part of the story that has teeth. Remember the peddler who went up the ridge road and never came back. Remember Troupé's dogs, gone one by one, and the bear tracks circling his house in the snow, and the human voice in the dark learning to imitate an animal. Remember the surveyor's careful, sickened note about the gnawed bones and the fires in the sealed chamber and the long time the family went on living down there after the door was closed. Whatever the Yarnwicks had been when they arrived, by the end they were something you would not want coming down your ridge road in the dark. The old world did not only leave behind beautiful masonry and free power, it left behind something that could get inside a bloodline and hollow it out and refill it, over 100 years, with itself. The Yarnwicks paid for their memory by ceasing, slowly, to be people at all. And that is the real horror of the reset, if the buried record is telling the truth. Not just that a world was destroyed and covered over, but that the truth of it became something no ordinary person could hold on to and remain whole. That to remember the old world fully, to live beside it and tend it and let it in, was to be changed by it into something monstrous. The people who forgot got to stay human. The one family that refused to forget got sealed into a hillside, more like the ridge than like the men who buried them. Remembering had a cost, and the Yarnwicks paid it in full, in the coin of their own humanity. So what do we do with a story like this? What is a person supposed to do, sitting in the ordinary world, hearing that the ground under a highway in Missouri once held a buried house and a warm machine and 7 wrong bodies, and that all of it was crated up and lost on purpose? The first thing, I think, is to stop pretending the curve in the highway does not exist, because it does. Whatever you believe about the Yarnwicks, about the mud, about the reset and the old world and the free and ambient power, there are physical facts sitting in the landscape that the official story cannot account for and does not try to. There is a highway that bends around empty ground for no recorded reason. There are buildings all over this earth sunk to their windows in grey silt with no flood on record to have done it. There are cut and fitted stones that our tools cannot reproduce, credited to men with copper chisels. There are tall, heavy-boned, long-skulled remains that surface again and again and vanish again and again into the same institutional dark. These are not beliefs. These are objects and measurements and curves in roads. You do not have to accept a single word of the interpretation to be troubled by the evidence. And once you are troubled by the evidence, you have already stepped off the smooth path they laid down for you, and there is no getting back onto it. Now, in fairness, and because you deserve the whole picture and not just the parts that fit neatly together, there are people who have spent real effort trying to explain the Yarnwick affair in ordinary terms, and their arguments should be heard. They will tell you that the buried house is a garbled memory of a real but mundane event, an isolated family that met a bad end, dressed up over 90 years of retelling into something supernatural. They will point out that hill country produces stories like this by the hundred, that the Ozarks in particular are thick with tales of feral clans and haunted ridges, most of them provably invented. They will say the grey sediment is just an ordinary flood deposit, that the region does flood, that landslides do bury things. They will argue that the strange masonry is exaggerated, that the tall bones are simply tall people, that the elongated skulls were reported by an untrained surveyor who did not know what he was looking at. They will note, correctly, that we do not have the artifacts, that we do not have the bones, that we have only copies of a report and 3 second-hand accounts, and that this is exactly the kind of evidence that cannot be checked. And they will point out that a story you cannot check is a story you should hold loosely. All of that is fair. All of that is worth sitting with honestly, and I would be lying to you if I pretended the ordinary explanation had nothing going for it. If you want to believe that the Yarnwicks were just an unfortunate family and everything else is the compounding of rural imagination and institutional carelessness, the evidence does not make that impossible. It cannot, precisely because the evidence was allowed to disappear. But notice what that skeptical account has to assume in order to hold together. It has to assume that 4 separate sources, preserved by accident across nearly a century, independently invented the same details. It has to assume that the highway bends around that ground for some reason no engineer ever wrote down. It has to assume that the crated remains and artifacts, which have a receiving record, simply evaporated through ordinary carelessness rather than deliberate removal. It has to assume that the surveyor, a career state employee with nothing to gain, fabricated measurements and then ruined his own life defending them. It has to assume that the same pattern, anomalous find, quick fencing, quiet removal, discredited witness, which repeats at site after site across this country and this world, is at every single site a coincidence. The ordinary explanation is not impossible. It is just, at a certain point, more of a stretch than the thing it is trying to explain away. You have to decide for yourself where that point is. I have told you where it is for me. As for the ridge itself, it is still there, and it is still closed. The fence that went up in 1956 has been replaced and reinforced more than once. The land around it changed hands quietly over the years and ended up, through a chain of holdings that is genuinely difficult to trace, out of public reach. People who have gone looking, and there have been a few, report the same things. A gravel track that ends at a gate, signs, a low grassy swell of hillside beyond the fence, unremarkable in every way, except that nothing has ever been built on it, and nothing ever will be. And the curve in the highway, bending around the whole thing, exactly where the old maps say the buried house once stood. A handful of those searchers have gone at night, which I do not recommend and am not endorsing. And a few of them have come back with the same detail, told separately, the way the 4 old sources told their story separately. They say that if you stand at the fence in the dark, and the wind is down, and you hold very still, you can feel something coming up through the soles of your feet. Not a sound exactly, a hum, low and steady and warm, from somewhere far below the grass. The same hum the preacher felt in 1861, when he asked the old grandfather what was down there, and got the only honest answer anyone in this whole story ever gave. The old world does not stay buried just because they covered it. There is one more thing I have to show you before we close, and it is the piece that took me longest to run down, because it is the piece the erasing hand worked hardest to bury. The Yarnwicks were not the only ones. Once you have the shape of this story in your head, the buried house, the tended machine, the family slowly turned into something else, the quiet fencing and the vanished evidence, you start seeing that shape in other places, in other records, in other cracks between the archives. And the resemblances are too exact to be coincidence. There is a case out of the southern Appalachians, a full state away, from the 1870s. A family the local records call the Holmans, living far up a creek in country that maps of the day left blank. Same pattern, point for point. They arrived without arriving, in a house no one remembered being built. They bought nothing a farm family should need, and one thing no farm family could use, in their case not lamp oil but salt, cartloads of it, hauled up a mountain to a household of 9. They kept to themselves, went pale, went nocturnal, and by the end were spoken of in the same lowered voices, with the same warnings to keep the children off the same kind of road. And then, in a single hard winter, the Holmans were gone, and the creek that ran past their place was said afterward to run warm even in the deepest cold. No one has ever satisfactorily explained the warm creek. No one has ever tried very hard. There is a case out of the upper Midwest, from the 1880s. A Norwegian family settled on a claim that turned out to sit over a cut stone chamber they were never supposed to find. There is a case out of the desert southwest, older, harder to date, a people the surrounding settlers called by a name that translates roughly as the ones who keep the fire below. There is even a fragment of a case out of the old country, carried over in the memory of immigrants, of families back in Europe who were known as tenders of certain hills, certain ruins, certain places where the ground was warm and the stone was too well cut, and the local church had, at some point in the deep past, gone to great trouble to wall something up. Different families, different decades, different continents even, and under every one of them the same buried world, and around every one of them the same slow tightening of the same quiet noose. Anomalous find, frightened neighbours. A sealing or a burning or a burying, a fence, a removal, a discredited witness, and then silence, and a label stuck over the top of it all. Savage family, feral clan, cursed household. A label whose only real job is to make you file the whole thing under folklore and move along. I'm not asking you to take the Holmans or the firekeepers of the desert on faith, any more than I am asking you to take the Yarnwicks on faith. I am asking you to notice the pattern, because a single strange story is folklore. But the same strange story, told with the same specific details, by people who never met, on land that never touched, across a century and an ocean, is not folklore anymore. It is a report. It is a great many frightened people, in a great many places, all describing the same thing they were not supposed to see. And the thing they were all describing is a world under this one, and a handful of families who found the doors to it, and what it cost every last one of them to keep those doors from closing. Now let me take you back down the stone stair one final time to the thing in that chamber I have mostly kept in the corner of your eye, because it may be the most important object in the entire account. The tablets. Remember them? Dozens of fired clay tablets, covered edge to edge in the geometric script that ran around the walls. The same script the last Yarnwicks had begun to scratch into the stone from the inside as their own language failed them. A library. An entire buried library, in a language no living person could read, crated up in 1956 and shipped east into the dark with everything else. But here is what the surveyor did before the crates left his hands. He copied. Not all of it. He had neither the time nor the training, but he was a careful man, and he understood that he was holding something that might not survive contact with the higher authority that was already circling the site. So he traced. Page after page in his personal notebook, he copied the symbols from a handful of the tablets, as exactly as an untrained hand could manage, and those tracings survive in the same personal copy of his report that survived everything else. They are the only piece of the buried library left in the world above. For decades those tracings meant nothing to anyone, a page of meaningless geometry from a discredited surveyor. But in the years since, a small number of people who take this seriously have set the Yarnwick tracings beside the geometric markings reported at those other sites, the Holman Chamber, the Desert Stone, the walled-up hills of the old country, and the tracings are not meaningless anymore, because they match, the same handful of recurring figures, the same repeated arrangement. Not a random scatter of shapes, but a consistent system, appearing at site after site across the whole spread of the buried world, which means it was a real language, a written language, shared across a civilization that our history says never existed. No one has read it. I want to be honest with you about that. Anyone who tells you they have fully translated the script of the old world is selling you something, and you should keep your hand on your wallet. But a language you cannot yet read is a very different thing from a story you invented. The Yarnwick tracings are not a story. They are data. They are a fixed, copyable, comparable set of marks that recur unchanged at sites that had no contact with one another. And every serious attempt to explain them away runs into the same wall the skeptics always run into with this case. To make the tablets ordinary, you have to assume the surveyor invented an entire consistent writing system in his spare time and then salted it invisibly into the records of other sites he never visited, for no reason, at the cost of his career. At some point the ordinary explanation asks more of your faith than the extraordinary one, and there is one detail in the tracings that the surveyor himself flagged in a shaking margin note that is almost impossible to read in the surviving copy. Among the recurring figures, there is one that appears more often than any other, at the Yarnwick site and, as it turned out, at the others. A single symbol, repeated like a signature, like a warning, like a name. The surveyor did not know what it meant. He only wrote, beside his careful tracing of it, 4 words: "It is a door." It is a door. That is where the paper trail of the old world runs out, on a symbol a frightened surveyor thought meant door, copied from a tablet that was crated up and lost, pulled from a chamber that was fenced and forgotten, under a house that was buried and taken down by the hill itself. Door after door after door, shut on the same warm and patient dark. And a written language, still unread, in which the most common word appears to be the word for the one thing every layer of this story keeps trying and failing to close. Sit with that for a moment. A vanished people, a buried civilization, a written language we still cannot read, and the one word we can almost make out is the word for the thing that will not close. I want to go back, before we finish, to the years no witness ever saw, the years behind the sealed door, because we know, from the state of the remains, that the Yarnwicks did not die quickly in that chamber. They lived down there, in the dark, for a long time after the men from the valley walled them in. And when you sit with that fact, really sit with it, it becomes the most haunting part of the whole account, and the part the official label works hardest to keep you from thinking about. Picture it as plainly as you can. A December night in 1866, a dozen frightened men on the ridge with lamps and shovels and mortar, and a family that does not fight them, does not beg, does not run down the hill toward the guns, but turns instead and goes back down the stone stair, back down into the warm and humming dark, choosing the buried world over the world of men. And then the wall goes up behind them, timber and stone and mortar, closing the seam between above and below. The men work through the freezing night, and by morning the door is gone, and the family is on the other side of it, and the hill begins, over the coming seasons, to take the house down over their heads. But they were not dying, that is the thing. On the other side of that wall was not a tomb. It was the old world, still lit, still warm, its buried passages running off into the dark toward places the men above never dreamed of. The Yarnwicks had spent a century learning those passages, tending that light, becoming more and more like the ridge. When the door closed, it did not close them into a grave. It closed them into their true home. And it closed the rest of us out. How long did they last down there? The remains suggest years. Years of fires whose ashes the surveyor found. Years of animals hunted and gnawed in the buried dark, brought up through passages from somewhere the men above never knew. Years of the geometric script spreading across the walls as the last of them, one by one, stopped writing in any human hand and began writing in the language of the thing they served. Somewhere in those years, the human part of the Yarnwicks finished going out, the way a lamp goes out, slowly, and then all at once. And somewhere in those years, the last one died, alone or nearly so, in a warm stone room under a hill, in a country that had already forgotten the family ever existed, and still the machine hummed. And still the light moved, slow as syrup, through the dark metal. And it went on humming, and the light went on moving, for 90 more years, over the bones of the people who had given up everything they were to keep it alive. There is a cruelty in that which I cannot get past. The Yarnwicks were destroyed for remembering, yes, but they were also, in the end, used. The old world did not love them back. It did not save them. It took 100 years of their oil and their labour and their humanity, and it took their bodies too, threading its dark metal through their very bones, and it gave them nothing in return but the dark and the hum and the slow unmaking of everything that made them people. They were caretakers of a thing that did not care, and when the door closed on them, the thing they had served did not so much as flicker. Now set that human ruin beside the last piece of the pattern, the piece that ties the Yarnwicks to you, sitting where you are right now. The men who sealed that door were not villains. Read the sources again, and you will not find cruelty in them. You will find terror and grief and a desperate rural determination to protect their children from something coming down the ridge road in the dark. They did the only thing they could think to do. They shut the door and buried the memory and went back to their fields, and they told their children a simple story with a simple label, Savage Family, Stay Off the Ridge, and that label held for 90 years because it was easier to live with than the truth. And that is exactly, precisely, what was done to the whole continent. A door was shut. A memory was buried. A simple story with a simple label was handed down. Empty land, simple tools, ordinary history, and it held because it was easier to live with than the truth. The men of 1866 were not the conspiracy. They were us. They were what any frightened people do when they touch the edge of the old world and cannot bear what they find. They cover it, they label it, they look away, and they raise their children to look away too. The only difference in the entire account, is that 4 fragile threads survive the covering: a surveyor's copy, a farmer's journal, a folded letter, a folklorist's notebook, 4 accidents of preservation, 4 cracks the erasing hand did not reach, and because of them you got to look through the keyhole before the door swung all the way shut. Almost no one gets that. Almost every buried house, almost every tended machine, almost every family unmade by the old world, went under the mud and under the label and under the silence, with no thread left behind at all. The Yarnwicks are not rare because they happened. They are rare because, this once, someone wrote it down, and that should change how you walk through your own town. Because the Yarnwick Ridge is not some far-off anomaly in country you will never visit. The same evidence that surfaced under that hillside is sitting, right now, in the ordinary places you pass every day. If you have the eyes to see it, go and look at the oldest buildings in your own city. Look at the ones from the middle of the 1800s and before. Look at how many of them have windows at the level of the sidewalk, or below it, arched openings half swallowed by the ground, doorways that lead down to nothing, first floors that somebody at some point decided to call basements even though they were plainly built to face the open air. You have walked past 100 of them and never once asked the obvious question. Why is the ground floor underground? The story you were given says the streets were raised, the city built itself up, people kept piling new ground on top of old. And in a few specific places, that even happened, and it was written down, and you can read about it. But go and count how many buildings sit sunk in that same fine grey fill, with no such story attached, no record of any raising, no explanation at all beyond a shrug. Count the impossible stonework in your oldest churches and public halls, the carved detail that no one today could pay to reproduce, credited to a handful of labourers with simple tools and endless time. Count the ornate ironwork whose purpose no one can name. You do not need a buried house on an Ozark ridge to start seeing the old world. You need only to look, honestly, at the ground under your own feet, and notice how much of it is fill, and how much of what that fill covers was never meant to be underground at all. That is the gift the Yarnwicks left, if you can call it a gift. They are the one place the covering slipped, the one keyhole, and once you have looked through it, you cannot walk your own streets the same way again. Every sunken window is a small confession. Every impossible wall is a question the official story cannot answer. Every curve in a road that bends around empty ground for no written reason is a door, shut, with something patient behind it. The old world is not somewhere else. It is here, under you, under all of us, and the only real difference between your town and that Ozark ridge is that no surveyor happened to write your town down. So when someone tells you the Yarnwick Clan was just a savage family finally dug up after 90 years, you will know what that sentence is really for. It is a label, stuck over a door, by frightened people who could not bear what was behind it. It has been stuck there for 90 years and more, and you have just spent this hour prying up one corner of it. What you do with the gap you can now see through, whether you cover it back over because that is easier, or keep looking because you cannot help it, is the only question this whole story was ever really asking. Before I let you go, there is a question I get every time I tell this story, and it deserves a straight answer. If all of this is real, if the old world is down there and the evidence keeps surfacing, then why does the covering hold at all? Why do most people walk past the sunken windows and the impossible walls and never once feel the ground shift under the story they were told? And the answer, I think, is the hardest part of everything we have talked about. The covering holds because we help it hold, not out of malice, out of comfort. The men of 1866 shut the door because the truth behind it was unbearable, and every generation since has kept it shut for exactly the same reason. It is a great deal easier to live in a world with an ordinary past than to live in a world built on top of a buried and better one that was taken from us and hidden. The label does not survive because it is convincing. It survives because it is kind. It lets you keep walking. It lets you not feel the hum. And that is why the people who tend the covering almost never have to do anything dramatic to protect it. They only have to offer you the easy story and trust that you will take it, the way almost everyone always has. The Yarnwicks are proof that the door can be found. The silence around them is proof of how badly most of us would rather it stayed shut. You are one of the few who went looking anyway. Sit with what that means. And then decide, honestly, whether you are going to cover it back over like everyone before you, or whether you are one of the ones who, having felt the warmth coming up through the floor, simply cannot stop digging. Keep that decision close, because it is going to come up again in the next ridge and the next buried house and the next family that gave up everything they were to keep one small light from going out. This was only the first door. There are so many more of them still shut, and the pattern you learn today is the key that opens every one. Hold on to it. You are going to need it. Because here is the thing that should keep you up tonight. The men of 1866 sealed the door. The hill took the house down. The state fenced the ridge and lost the evidence and bent the road around it. Every layer of this story is another door being shut on the same buried thing. But not one of those doors ever put out the light. 90 years in the dark, and the machine was still warm. However many years it has been since 1956, and the searchers still feel the hum. Whatever is under that ridge was not destroyed by the covering, and it was not destroyed by the sealing, and it was not destroyed by the burying. It was only hidden. It is still down there. It is still running, and it is still, in its slow and patient way, waiting for the next family, foolish enough, or faithful enough, to build a house on top of it and start pouring in the oil. We started this hour on a hillside in 1956 with a road crew and a grading blade and a wall where there should have been only stone. We could just as easily have started it 1,000 miles from that ridge, at any of 100 other sites where the same grey mud swallowed the same impossible buildings and the same tall bones came up and vanished into the same official dark. The Yarnwicks are not special. That is the part that should stay with you. They are simply the one keyhole we managed to look through before the door was shut, because 4 fragile threads happened to survive in the cracks between the archives. For every Yarnwick ridge that leaves a record, there are countless others that left none, swept clean and built over and forgotten. The old world under the new one, the graveyard under the field, the light still warm in the dark under all of it. You were told this land was empty when your people came to it. You were told the buildings you live among were built by hands with simple tools. You were told the ground under your feet holds nothing but rock and root and the ordinary bones of ordinary history. The Yarnwicks are one small, stubborn piece of evidence that every part of that story deserves a second look, and that the people who tell it have gone to real trouble over real decades to make sure you never take one. A savage family in the Ozarks, unearthed after 90 years. That is how the story was labelled, and the label was doing exactly the job labels always do. It was there to make you look away. Do not look away. If this story got its hooks into you the way it got into me, then here is what matters now. This is not the only ridge, and this is not the only buried family. And the pattern I laid out today shows up in place after place after place once you know its shape. I am working my way through the ones that left a record, the ones with a surveyor's copy or a frightened farmer's journal or a letter folded into a family Bible, pulling them one at a time out of the cracks where the erasing hand did not reach. If you want to come with me through the rest of them, subscribe and stay close, because the next one I have been sitting on is stranger than this one, and it is closer to home than you would like. The old world is still down there, and we are only just starting to dig.